Aloha mai kākou. So our speaker comes from Oklahoma, and her name is the Reverend Rosemary McCombs Maxey, and she's a citizen of the Muscogee, which is Creek Nation of Oklahoma. She's also a member of Fellowship Congregational United Church of Christ in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Also a director of the Eagle Butte Learning Center in South Dakota. She is actually the very first Native American Indian woman ever ordained in the United Church of Christ. She's a retired clergy from the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference, and I don't know if Edith Guffey is still there, Rosemary, but you are also, obviously well known throughout the UCC. She served in many of the national boards and the committees, and has been a large voice for especially the United Church of Christ Council for American Indian Ministries. She is the winner of the 1997 Antoinette Brown Award, which was named after the very first woman who was ordained to Christian ministry in the United States. And she speaks on and has been an advocate for our Hawaiian prisoners who have gone into her state because of an overflow. So I guess that center called the Diamondback Correctional Facility. And in the early 2000s, she has been an advocate along with our ex-Papa Makua, Kahu Kenneth and also Kahu Kenneth. And even you may remember, probably it was 2006 and 2007, was the Reverend Phil Reller, who became a minister over here in Honolulu. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Reverend Rosemary McCombs Maxey.
He stays, don't go. And aloha. I'm bilingual, more or less, just in the pleasantries. I want to also mention that working with the Native Hawaiian prisoners, Ron Fujiyoshi was very instrumental in getting this ministry and advocacy going. And he was the person that I dealt with most regularly. And also Kekakpali and the others that you mentioned, but he was the main one who got us going. Just a little bit of background, because Ken had asked that I talk about introducing this film, and I wanted to just say, it's all about me, I'm in it, but somewhere along the line, there's more to it than that. The story that we were trying to tell was that our homelands are in the southeastern part of the continent, and down in Alabama, Georgia, northern Florida. Those states, before they were states, were our homelands. And so it was in these homelands that our people flourished and took care of that part of the land. And then colonization came, and Andrew Jackson became the president of the United States, and arranged for us, for the Native people in the Southeast, to be removed and relocated to Oklahoma. The Cherokee call this event the Trail of Tears, and I call this, or the Muscogee people call this, the Pitiful Road, or the road where we cried. And so our people were removed off of the millions of acres that we had taken care of up to this point, and then moved to Oklahoma to a place that represents what is now Oklahoma, and half of the state was in that original treaty. I talked about it in the devotional a little bit, in that that treaty was then abandoned when Oklahoma became a state, and Oklahoma took jurisdiction of all but 11 counties in Oklahoma. And then the subsequent Supreme Court decision is that we can have all that back now. So it's an interesting movement from the Southeast into Oklahoma, where we had to start all over again, building our languages, our ways of life, our clan system, medicines, medicine plants, all of those things had to be redone. So to make a long story short, Craig Womack, who is the director and the moderator of this video, was on the faculty at University of Oklahoma, and he had applied for this job at Emory, and Emory wanted him to come. He went out for the interview and said that it was a good interview. He really liked it, but he didn't really want to leave the Muscogee people in Oklahoma to go and teach in a place that he did not know. So we went through this conversation of how he could feel about it as going back to our homelands and, in a sense, reclaiming it for us. And I'm not just talking about declaring the land, but the land would be nice. We were talking about there are medicine plants still there. There are old ceremonial grounds that have been covered up and made into farmland. There are other remnants of our history and our culture in that area. And for him to go and teach at Emory would allow him access to help us reconnect with our homelands. And it was in that spirit that Craig found places for me to teach with him, to co-teach with him in some of the Native literature classes. And then I was invited by the Environmental Studies Department to teach the language with other persons who were going to teach about the environment and the plant life that was there. So there were a number of us involved in this back and forth to the state of Georgia particularly, but Georgia and Alabama, to revisit and reconnect with the plant life. And so there were medicine people from here who went back. There were people from our nation who went. I went, and others who speak the language went. Again, back and forth to see what we could see and learn, and also to try to leave something behind. It was in this time that I was beginning to teach the language out of my home. And so when they said, let's do this video, they couched it in language revitalization, preservation, and making it accessible, making the language accessible, that I thought was a great idea. And then we would go out to Georgia and Alabama and film this. But the surprise was on me, because they said, well, the film crew will show up at your house on such and such a date, and Craig will come out and we will do this film. So it was short notice, but I guess I agreed to it. I don't remember. And so in telling the story, my good friend, Craig Womack, knows all the questions to ask to make it the film that it is, asking about my life and how I fit into this realm of the United Church of Christ, as well as in Muscogee life, and how this came to be. So this video is about those experiences. I hope you can see it with that lens in mind as you look at the video.
Hat hayat kena lai chit miko sape mon gan po hayaf gatis. Hat hayat kena lai chit miko sape mon gan po hayaf gatis. Miko sapachi hodoses chinaho tais.
It's confusing in trying to remember who did what, but I just know that my mother's father, David, came out here to be a school teacher. He married Aggie, and then went back and got these saplings and brought them out here. The only surviving tree is this old pear tree that doesn't have long, I don't think, but it manages to produce, and we vie for the pears with the possums. Somebody lives in there. Milla was one of the ones that came on the Trail of Tears who was one of those that was rounded up and brought out. And so her arrival was different from the others. And the same was true on my grandmother's side. Her parents were Jenny Fish and Alex McIntosh. And Jenny Fish and her sister came from Alabama and came out, and they were all down here. And I'm assuming that these were the the upper creeks that settled in Millette area as a part of the holding tank before the Dawes Commission and then the allotment process.
Did your family talk about the journey to Oklahoma, the forced journey, the removal?
Only the stories that my grandmother told was that she had heard, and in storytelling, this is the way you say, Amona Hoyat, those who told me things told me this. And she said that the road was indeed sorrowful and pitiful, and people died along the trail. And in their stories, the women sometimes died in childbirth as they came across. The agony of seeing their parents die and then these children becoming orphaned. And then after they got here, they tried to find relatives for these children, and if they didn't, they were adopted by somebody. And generally, those were people from within their community, from their tribal towns and from their clans. She talks about those and talked about her mother's death, untimely death, but said, I just think the woman was worn out from all that she had seen and heard.
So a lot of the stories they told were kind of about realigning kinship systems after people had died, and getting them with people within their church or ceremonial grounds back together with somebody who could care for them given the loss of their parents.
Yeah, that was their first attempt of, and that was their responsibility too, from the systems that we come from. And this is why it's so difficult to pinpoint our DNA relationships with people. And when we think that these are our close relatives, we find out that they were really foster children of somebody else, and you don't know.
Yeah, it gets very complicated.
Yeah. But they did try to align and adopt them, and she and Aunt Martha tried to keep me in touch with this side of the family, and who was who in relationship to my grandmother. We didn't do that with the grandfather, the McCombs side, because that seems to be pretty well documented just because of their station in life. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, they wanted me to know my grandmother's side. My grandmother, we don't really know exactly how old she was, but she became orphaned and was adopted by a family who gave her name, Agnes Catch. And then when she was a teenager, probably pretty early in her life, like 16 or so, married and received or was assigned this allotment that we're standing on, 160 acres here. And then she had 2 children, and they were assigned acreages across the road, 80-acre parcels. Hokti hojifka dalgosin oatstundo yan hojifka Jimmy at least sketched Agnes Catch gejak doadis. Mumen ijosi and ijithwa ojit alak doadis yan man imiganan okhabok dois. I was telling you about my grandmother Agnes Catch. Her brother was Willie Catch, and he married Wilgofki women sequentially. And when they were giving out the land assignments, the Dawes Commission had given those land assignments, he refused his allotment, which would have been right up by our house. But he was given assigned land in Yuchi country. So out from Sapulpa was his 80 acres. And we used to go up to pay homage to his 80 acres because they found oil on his place. And after his death, and maybe 10, 20 years later or something, oil was discovered. And we were quite wealthy for just this brief little period of time while that oil was going on. I went to college on that, on those funds.
Now that's quite a story, really. I mean, so he resisted his Dawes allotment, like a lot of those snakes, the snake membership did that was with Chito Harjo. Then they found oil on land that he wouldn't take, but then your family still got it, and you got the boon of it and got educated.
I did.
I mean, that's irony.
It is irony. And we still have the mineral rights to that property.
How did he get killed?
He was in this is my mother's story. And so she would say that these people were taking him out to get him drunk. They asked him to bring the deed to his allotment, and they would go out drinking. And so they ran into another car and it decapitated him.
My goodness.
So when my mother's mother heard about it, ran over to the site and retrieved the deed from where she knew he kept it on his body.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that just the kinds of stuff you need to write about?
Well, yeah, that's a novel or something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
No, it's a very interesting part of our family history. Yeah. But the surviving of all of that is just phenomenal to me, coming the poverty and then the upswing and then the poverty and upswing again, how you come about all of that and survive. That's it. Willie Catch.
Yeah.
Thank you, Uncle Willie. So this is the house I grew up in. The original part of the house was a camp house out at Wiagofki, and my parents bought it and had it moved here. And it cost more to move it than it did to buy the house. Hey, Mickey, don't go. So the railroad track, the Fort Smith and Western Railroad track is this here, and the culvert is right about where Steve is pointing. The hobos jumped off near the culvert, and then they would come up to the house. And then there were Jewish salesmen that would come and jump off. They were paying customers, so I don't know why they did, but they would jump off and eat with my grandmother and then give her a bolt of cloth or rickrack or buttons or something like that in exchange for food. The hobos did cutting wood and stacking it and that kind of thing in exchange for food. Yeah. And the gypsies said, we'll play you music and dance for you, and they would come up to the house and do all of those things. And then occasionally they would give them a pot or a pan that they were selling. And then my grandmother wanted to see their camp. So she and her little girls came down the hill to see the camp, and the gypsies packed up and ran off. But yeah, so we've had gypsies, tramps, and thieves right here where, it's an isolated little place. Well, Craig, I'm really glad that we could come back to Tuskegee Church and look around again to just kind of remember and reflect about what has gone on here from the time of the building of the church and all. I need to pay homage to the spiritual presences that are always here for me when I come into the building.
I wanted to ask about the earliest Christian converts that you know of in your family, and whether or not that happened before removal or if it was after. Who were some of the first ones that you've heard about?
The McCombs family side, which was largely Scottish, I think they were Presbyterian in their religious upbringing, and I don't know of conversion experiences for them, but I just know that from them came preachers and deacons and lay leaders on that side. On the Jenny Fish Ella side, they were not church people, they were ceremonial people. And my grandmother told me about her conversion experience, and she was a woman's leader here and sat in the woman's leaders' chairs over behind you. And she said that she was a young woman when she met James McCombs, and that she had no intentions of being a part of church life, but the condition for her to stay with him was that she convert. So she converted, and she liked the role that was given to her as a faith keeper, and that helped her to try to keep other people faithful to the church. There are Muscogee Association, an association of Muscogee churches, and they include the Seminole and the Wichitas. And so we've always done things as an association of churches that not a single church could do, but these churches bound together by agreement could do larger projects and get together and do things. So Tuskegee was one of those sites where we came for camping, and outside there used to be like 9 or 12 little camp houses around, and so they had all the means in place where you could come out here and camp for a week of like family camp and stay here for revival type services, curriculum for young Christians and all the way down to childhood. So you grow up in these places meeting your relatives. And so we would come over and stay for a week at a time on these grounds.
And when does your family's history first start to intersect with this 1856 church? Is it from the very beginning?
I would say 1857.
And Weagufke, do you happen to know the founding date of Weagufke, or more or less?
Yeah, it's about the same time. We're talking about celebrating our 250th year next year.
2 decades after removal, almost exactly. The second kind of marker in Baptist life is the institution for which it's named, which is baptism. And in Creek culture, it's really interesting to me that we have all these going to water rituals, obviously, in ceremonial life. And then in the Creek Baptist Church, baptism is such a distinct ritual when it's done the old-timey way. And you had such a ceremony, and just the community of women who guided you through this and all the different aspects of it. So I was wondering if you could just go through a little bit about how that worked and how they mentored you and what they dressed you in and some of the advice. I know there's a lot there. So
the women gathered us up in the morning and had the conversation. And the conversation went something like, now that you migusaba hagiton michiga, yet chimadutkida hagitos, these are the works that you will do as you become. So you're one of us now. And it was like a rite of passage into adulthood. And all of a sudden it was just there. So they talked to me about prayer. They talked to me about homekeeping. and they talked to me about menstruation. And I thought, okay, I'm 9. I don't know what they're talking about in this particular part. So my mother had to tell me about that part after I got home, you know. And so it was, looking back on it, it was really a wonderful conversation, although it went so fast. And my remembering it, you know, was probably faulty too, but they were so loving and gentle about getting ready. And so we were out in the camp house out here and off to the side, and nobody else was there but those women and me. The Indian Nation Turnpike now goes over the baptismal pool. There was a pond there. So we walked and just quietly singing and went down to the water's edge. And the deacon had already measured how far out we would go based on my height, and put a stick there so we would know to go in that direction. And the preacher who was baptizing me was kind of a frail person, and he had a walking stick of his own. So I got a little more anxious as we got to the water's edge, but the little old ladies behind me said, pray, say the Lord's Prayer, any prayer you can think of while you're being baptized. And I always took that as a sign I needed to pray that I survived. But while we were out in the water, he said, are you ready to do this? Are you really, really ready to do this? And looking back at all the people on the shore, I said, yeah, I'm ready. So, you know, he baptized me, and they said there were snakes at the other end of the pond, but my father was a pastor, preacher that I respected a lot, and then his father before him was also a minister. So these were big people in my childhood eyes. His preaching style was that of a storyteller. He was a good pulpiteer, no notes, just and following a sequence of stories and summarizing them. He was quite good at that. And my mother would say, that one was too long, that one was interesting, that one was, yeah. So they were a good team. And then when, of course, he was pastor at Mvskoke, she was right there to support him in those kinds of things. Tuskegee was like a second home. And the cousins that were here were playmates and then friends, you know, as I was growing up. So in order for everybody to understand, we always default to English. But back in the day, you had to default to Creek. If you came to church, you were expected to participate and let the Creek people sing and pray and preach in Creek. And you were an observer to that, or you learned the language. My father engaged me in analyzing sermons. So you come home with one thing that you thought was funny, one thing that you learned, and one thing that you thought that the minister was trying to convey, and one thing you can do. So those 4 things were stuff that I had to come home and talk with him about.
How did you first become aware that you're called to the ministry?
It was something that I appreciated about my father being called on, particularly in times of special needs, funerals and illness and those kinds of things. So I did my practice on the farm. I baptized some frogs and dismembered some crickets and put their legs back on and various things like that. Conducted wonderful funeral services for things that died on the farm, and enjoyed singing old hymns and stuff to them. And
you were kind of Francis de Assisi of the Creek Baptist farm.
Yeah, that's true.
And one of the things I've always been interested in is you've done some writing about, well, in fiction, but it has to do with the way in which your parents' Christian views and their roles at church also intersected with Muscogee Creek beliefs and traditions. And I was wondering if you could say something about this kind of overlap, or however that worked.
I think the overlap is the Muscogee culture in general, and the belief systems that were present when they came here, and it got Christianized in the process. So there were things like, my father did not participate in the medicine belief system. He was Western medicine all the way. But my mother made room for Indian medicines in her life and respected the medicine people around. And if she had remained faithful to the grounds, she would have been one of the medicine women, I think. She was being taught by a woman who had selected her. And so she would have been like 4 years old, 5 years old, and stayed there with this woman to study some of the things that were important. But then when she went off to boarding school, she lost that, but she had a high regard for medicine ways. And both of them had friends who were devout, ceremonial people in their ways, and they exchanged ideas and conversation and all. So I think that's what led me to think that there was more to them in their Muskogee tradition than what we were able to see or what other people might have seen as their persona. Okay, they're members of the church. They've severed their ties with us. But they held a high regard, and we did a lot of things that were very Muskogee things at home in our life ways, fixing the food with a good attitude, caring for our house, and then my father offering prayers throughout the farmland that we stay on in a traditional manner. So I think those were things that overlapped or cross over and also intersect. When we lived in our old house across the creek, in the summertime, we sat out on the porch to cool off, to talk, tell stories, and things like that. And on the various occasions when it was time for green corn, you could hear, I assume it was Wiagofki stomp that we could hear across the hillside. You could hear faint waftings of the people dancing. And that was back when there were large crowds gathered, I suppose. And so my mother spoke, she was the one who spoke more knowledgeably about what the rituals were and the green corn and the ribbon dance and other dances and things that she had seen as a young girl, a little girl. But my mother had phenomenal memory, so she could remember things like when she was 5 and going to the ribbon dance. And she had not planned. Her father was a Methodist person who didn't want his children raised at the grounds, but in defiance of him, the mother said, "We're going, you need to see this." And she dressed her daughters up to dance. And so they went. Wagat haga jokes, moo, waga. We had an old pickup that had sideboards on it, and my father would take those sideboards off and put them aside. And so I would go out there and arrange chairs in there or boxes or something for my congregation to sit on. And I could really hold forth in those days. But I think that as I look back, it was all I knew. That was what we did. That's what my family did, was go around and somebody sat up in the pulpit and the rest of us had to sit out. I thought that preaching might be something I would enjoy. But every now and then I'd hear these sermons about the man is the head of the household and the woman is I don't even remember what they said about women particularly, but the man was the head of the household and Jesus is the head of the church and women are to keep silent in the church and men are the teachers and the preachers. But I had not paid much attention to that because my parents were saying, whatever it is you want to do and whatever God calls you to do, you respond to that call. And in that context, I thought, well, I can do just about anything. And so when I was getting prepared to go to college, so my senior year, I was talking to the missionary that we had at that time about this call to the ministry. And he said to me, you don't have what it takes, wink, wink. So I later learned that I didn't have an appendage that was necessary to minister.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Just how do you use that in ministry? So I talked to one of the women's leaders, not from my church, but from somebody in another context who had worked with BIA schools, about what she thought about women ministers. And she said, it's not in the Bible. So that was pretty much the end of that discussion. So, in that process, I would come back to I needed to be working in a church and looked for church-related vocations. And I found that in responding to those, the race card was held to me. If I joined a white church and wanted to be the director of a Sunday school program or something like that, I got a response was, well, we don't have any Indian members in that church, or we don't have Indian members in that Sunday school, so we wouldn't be able to use you for that. So it still was not satisfying. It was not an answer that I really wanted to hear. And so I just said, well, I'm packing up and moving away, and ended up in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, to escape. The Vietnam War gave us opportunities to rebel or protest. And I think it's in the protest that the call for social justice has manifested itself. Sitting with young philosophy majors and talking those kinds of things through just revealed a different framework from which to say, there are things wrong in this world. There are things that are personally wrong, and I can do some things to make the world a better place and safer for other people who may follow after me. Going to New York City and meeting powerful women. I mean, just the energy from their conversations and their reinterpretations of scriptures and the Magnificat. I had not looked at the Magnificat as tumbling down the wealthy and letting the the lowly people, the starving people, be raised to prominence. I had not read that in that verse of scripture or that passage of scripture. Things like that were very energizing. And so you could say social justice comes from or are foundational in these scriptural passages. And so reinterpreting those things and putting social justice issues together was a very important part of moving into these avenues of protest. I met a lot of powerful women who encouraged me to come to their meetings, their gatherings, and would talk to me about feminism and then how theology could be interpreted through a feminist lens. I went to a Presbyterian church and a woman was preaching. I heard Elizabeth Hambrick Stowe preaching at this Presbyterian church. And so after it was over, I went to her and said, how did you get to do this? And she said she was from the United Church of Christ. There was a path to ordination.
I was wondering, thinking back a little bit, when you or how you kind of expressed this to your parents, that they were steeped in Southern Baptist life, and you expressed the possibility that this may not be a supporting role for you, but a pulpit ministry or a preaching ministry. What did they say, or how did they respond?
Shock. Oh, shock and awe, I guess.
Yeah.
The summer that I decided to go to Lancaster Seminary to prepare for the ministry, I came home and said to my mother, I'm going back to school. And she had said, haven't you had enough school? No, I haven't learned it all yet. But I wanted to prepare for ordination. And she did not, change facial expressions or anything like that. Just, oh, kind of thing. And then I knew that she went to prepare the path to my father and say, she's going to say to you she wants to be ordained. Yeah. And he said, well, if that's what you're being called to do and you can find a place in that denomination, well, don't let people stand in your way. Go do it. So my dad told me that he talked to Uncle Jim, pastor at Tuskegee. And so Uncle Jim said, our people have always picked out people that are going to be in leadership positions, and we've known all along that she will do that. And she's been called, but we didn't know what she was called to, but we've recognized that she's got a call, and if this is her call, then she should respond to it, and don't let anybody stop.
Hano Gitchgan Homejajan Howe Talofamen.
Then I met Paul, my key to getting into ministry. So we married and moved to New York City to pastor Park Slope Baptist Church. It was a long journey to find my way into some time later to be in seminary and ordained in the United Church of Christ in the 1980s, where women were few in ordination opportunities and pastoring churches. So it was kind of fun to pastor a church, and the conference minister of our area said, well, there's this little church and they've never had a woman pastor before, let alone an Indian pastor, but you just practice your craft for as long as they let you, and it'll be a couple of years and you'll move on. Well, I stayed there 12 years. So I think I learned my lesson with baptizing chickens and frogs. Paul, thankfully, was very helpful in helping me get where I needed to go at that time, and the birth of our 2 children occurred and all of those things. We've been working on learning the Creek hymns, because sometimes we get away from it because English is all around us. It's so much easier to lead in the English songs. And then we also have a lot of English-speaking members, so we accommodate them and kind of skip the Creek part. And so I was sitting back there thinking that we need to sing Creek songs. And the interim pastor asked me if I would teach them. And all of them wanted phonetic spelling, which is kind of antithetical to my pedagogy of how you teach the language. But if they would sing it, I would do it. It just became more of a pattern in these last 3 or 4 years.
there's something about them with that protracted length, and it's like the syllables of these hymns, it's as if you put a fence stretcher, like a barbed wire stretcher, on each side of these words and pulled them out as long as you possibly can. But they're all about taking time, I think. Like, there's so few places where you do that, but they almost get into that real meditative state where a syllable or a chant or a hum, can put you in this certain place. And they're about, at least for that moment, taking time to remember these spiritual people that you're talking about, maybe that have passed on, and to have time to do that. That's what I love about them. And there's something about singing them, even if you can't sing a lick, that feels really good.
There is this resurgence and a reteaching of the hymns that is important not only to our spiritual church life or our traditional life, but the language learning that you can use with those hymns, the language teaching. I probably lost some momentum when I went away to graduate school, and there's nobody speaking Muscogee, not even a chicken in sight to go talk to, or a llama for that matter. So I lost some momentum in my Western education. And in my life's journey, I've lived in Pennsylvania and New York City and in Maryland before moving back home. And in those places, there weren't opportunities to talk to people, except for the children. They were born in Brooklyn, New York, of all places. And so we used our Muskogee language in early things, mostly labeling food and asking for things or questions around our own interests when the boys were small. So I used the language there. They grew up and went back to Oklahoma to study in college, where the Muskogee language was offered as an academic study. And so a lot of the language that they were using had to do with knowing when the Muskogee language was a noun and when it was a verb and when it was an adjective and adverb. And I had never considered that because of the naturalness of the language. And I just thought a sentence was all one word and that it could be unpacked.
I've been around you, of course, when you're talking Indian to people, and what does that do for you? I'm a non-speaker, and so many of us are. Mm-hmm. I think that part of us is just curious. Like, we know there's something that happens in those moments, but we don't know what it is.
And we're not telling.
And of course, part of it is probably inexplicable, which makes it all the more curious. But just from your perspective, what do you think happens when you're able to do that with this very select group of people now?
Yeah, well, it's just so energizing and invigorating to find somebody else who talks this way, And there are word pictures in my mind when I'm talking this language, and it takes me into worlds that I can't do in English. And that's about as good as I can explain it, because it is something else.
You became involved with trying to do a language immersion school.
I had gone to a couple of workshops on language immersion. And so that's what we tried that first time around. And, those interesting folks that joined us had no notion of what the language was about, how to say anything. And here we are supposed to just repeat after me and learn it. But these were paper and pencil professors, lawyers, scholars of other sorts, And we gathered that first time, and I think you, Ted, and I said 3 years. We'll try it for 3 years. And then at the end of 3 years, you said I could quit. But there's still people who want to come, and they count on it.
What would you like to see the future of that be? I mean, even beyond what it is now, what are your hopes for it?
Now we have this little grandchild, and we need that language community to be around for him. I gave up hoping for a fluent speaker. I'm not that fluent myself, you know, when it comes to remembering a lot of the words that we need when we need it. But we have reminders around the room with words printed on where the glasses are and where the cups are, and reminders to speak the language on a daily basis. So I guess exposure to the language is one thing. Revitalizing it through these exercises.
Monga ya ido huilat. Wajina imbonaga kalkamba hojifkados. Isti Muscogee imbonaga man nagi hojifkadomat kisligodos hobodo yesen. Fuliat aze in mahi halwit os. And when I came home, then have really made this conscious effort to use it every day and practice on somebody or something. And that's where the chickens and the llama come in handy, the cats. Iste Larry, Lorenzo Lama, Stungun jo Hayatka. Stungun jo Hayatka. Chihijida Boyages. Hombida Chiaja. Adis, Hombus. Adis, Adibus. Mo. Hombida Healy dosje. Don't go. Chinda Katsikiri, Ahlitska. Aha, Chilawidi. Moyos. Chilawi Hagi be weddies. Bosi Hombida Nojis. Stungon Wilagatska. Gender to lose so back head kid for this. So she bucks tea. Come on. Adis. Adibus. Oh, no. Ow! Chichabaki dee. I know it. Just the mosquitoes. Hijibus. Yada. Dolosi ojes. Legibus chi. Chostagi ojes.
All right. What a beautiful story. I mean, we're going to start with all these questions and answers. I mean, I didn't really know what to expect from watching this, but it's, you know, from our Hawaiian Indigenous perspective, it just parallels so much. I mean, I would, you know, that part where you were nearly in tears was the part that I was nearly in tears, because you said,
our people have always picked our the giftings for our people to do that, you know, because Hawaiian people back then also chose, when before the babies came out, they knew what they were meant to do in life. And when you said that, I went, oh my gosh, you parallel that so much. I mean, how, I could tell it affected you, but I wanted you to unpack that one even more.
Well, at the time, you know, it's in the comfort and safety of my living room. So it was, you know, easier to talk about it in that emotive way. But it is heartfelt to talk about an intimate call that you can't respond to at the time. You know, there's all these barriers in your way. And for me, I didn't know that these were being put up as artificial barriers, and that something could happen if I persevere and keep at it. But as I talked about it, I was in tears as well. And he said that his issue was because as a person who was gay, that he had been told that he had no future in the church either. Mm-hmm. He had to deal with that issue in the same way that I was dealing with being female. And if they weren't filming, I think we would have had a good time just sitting there and crying about life in general at that point. But it's, I guess, anytime that we are discouraged from something that we know is right and is possible, that's hard to deal with. So I guess that's what I think about the issue in particular.
You know, especially in what we consider our Kalavina churches, our old traditional small Hawaiian churches. I loved when you went through the small churches of your past, it's probably a present, and you said that when you go into a Creek church, everything was done in the language. That is what we still try to do, you know, because as the generations go on, you sort of lose the language, but the cultural aspect is hopefully still adhered to. You know, how do you, like how you said, how do you do that intersection between your culture and the Christianity piece within those churches?
I still grapple with that a lot, and even more so in these recent days where my local UCC church is 75 miles away, and so I can't make that trip as often as I might. But my childhood church is like 7 miles away, and that's where my friends are, and that's where my memories of being a follower of Jesus are. But what I often hear from people who speak with authority is that a certain form is very colonial in the interpretation of scripture and the posturing of families. So it's very hard to hear. So what do? Do you set that aside while you enjoy visiting with your friends and remembering old times? And we have meals at the church on a regular basis, and that's where a lot of community building occurs. And I wash dishes. I'm the chief dishwasher, just so that we can share those stories around the table and hear, you know, while you're washing dishes. And, you know, you can turn your back to everybody else that's out here to whisper your secrets. But that's where, for me, ministry is. And I, at this stage in life, can't change the church. I can't change this little community church from what it is. All by myself is what it would essentially be. So I go there for what I can do for the friends that I associate with, and I go there to participate In the life of the church, communion service is one of those places where I really do like to be present, because it's a separate service, not like the Anglo churches where it's kind of tacked on at the end of the service, but it's a separate service and very meaningful to me. So I go to those kinds of cultural things that make going to church good for me. So I do pick and choose, I think, what I like about it.
Oh, nice. You know, Kahu Ran Fujiyoshi just came on to say aloha.
Aloha to you.
Hey, maybe you could speak a little bit on how you and Ron interfaced when you folks were doing the advocacy for those prisoners.
Well, you know Ron. I think everybody in Hawaii knows Ron. I met him through the Council on Racial and Ethnic Ministry when it was really a good organization within the church. And he was an outspoken advocate for justice in a way that I didn't always hear from other people. And so I enjoyed him in that space and time and all. But when we became collegial in our relationship with the prisoners, I had just gone to the little grocery store and bought some milk and bread and was on my way home when something caught my eye in the newspaper sales, where you put in the money and get your newspaper, was Muscogee Nation planning to incarcerate Hawaiian prisoners. And I went, what? How could they do that? Are they going to go over and build a prison, or, what is it? So I bought this newspaper and I came home and the phone rings almost simultaneously. And it's Ron on the other end saying, we're going to come and you're going to go with us to the prison. And so we went to this Diamondback Correctional Facility, but we also went to the women's prison too. And he had with him Uncle Sam, who has passed away. But after that, it was just following his lead in how to go about getting us in, and his encouragement once we did get in, that sustained our time with the prisoners while they were here in Oklahoma.
Oh my goodness. Well, he is a blessing to us over here. Thank you, Kahu Ron. I liked the piece that talked about baptism. It was really interesting to me because you talked about it as being a rite of passage into womanhood. But besides that, what was the preparation for baptism in that Christian manner, outside of the other thing you're talking about?
Where you go down to the farm's pond and go get immersed, baptism by immersion. And the path from the church to this pond was a considerable distance. And so I think it was made more meaningful by all of that. We had the little headband, scarf type thing, and these were set aside for every baptismal candidate. So whether you were a boy or a girl, you put this over. And they offered all kinds of symbolism for the explanation of why we did it. And that was that, once you were blind in your sin, and then you were baptized, and when you were out of the water, then you could see more clearly your life's journey and that. But I think there's a practical thing about it. And that was to keep whatever was in the pond, like scum or bugs or anything like that, keep that out of your hair. And the thing around your waist was so that in case you started floating off, somebody could grab you by that waistband and pull you back in. That's what I think it is, but I can't get anybody to agree with me. And we still do it, but we have an indoor baptismal tub, and we still use those symbols.
Yeah, so so we're asking for questions from those who are viewing. If you have anything for Rosemary. In the meantime, I have so many questions. I mean, one of the things that you were talking about was your language. It takes, you said, it takes me into worlds I cannot go in English. What a beautiful essence that it says, that your language is that beautiful that you cannot translate it in not just can't translate it, but you don't even know how to do an experience in English that you do in your language.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you have that in Hawaiian too. There are some words that you use that I just enjoy hearing it. I have no idea. Well, I do have an idea because there's a context with the conversation, but there's just some words. And one of my favorite words is kuleana, and I believe it's the word for responsibility.
Yeah.
And I just like that word. And I wish we had a word that was as cool as that to say about our responsibility in our language, but ours has to be unpacked, and it's a longer word for it.
Yeah, but it sounds like in most indigenous languages, like for instance, when we use kuleana or your word for your llama, when you why don't you tell everybody what you call your llama? That's pretty funny.
Well, he's Lorenzo Lama, the llama that's present, but the llama that I had before this one was Malama Pono, and I got that from the prisoners. So when they were leaving, when we were leaving, and they were waving goodbye to us, they would say Malama Pono after they said Ahui Ho, I think, but Malama Pono. So when I got that llama, I named it Pono, so I could say my llama is Pono. So I enjoy that.
And even in your churches, when you and the gentleman were speaking, you said the way you're singing the old songs and things recognizes these people who have passed on. And so it codifies the past and the present as you move forward. I love that intentional way of keeping what we call kupuna, or your elders, with you as you move through life. So I love what you folks are talking about. I mean, our small Hawaiian churches, or actually all of our churches, have these little pictures of families or your pastors, or all of these, just to bring those people back to the forefront of your thoughts, and then they come up in your conversations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. Yeah, the hymns that we sing, that we remember our elders singing, all of the songs that my father led in singing, whenever that song is sung, I can picture him. But when I go to Tuskegee, I can hear my grandmother leading some of those songs, because it was just, you can just feel them there. And things like funerals and other special occasions where they begin to sing those old songs, you can hear them singing with you, which is amazing to me. I'm not much of a phenomenologist, but when you can hear them singing with you, alongside you, they're there.
Oh, beautiful. It was interesting that you had talked about the mineral rights at the early part, and then and that's how you went to school. But I know that you've been an advocate against the Standing Rock issue, and then I think some of your people came to our Mauna Kea initiative also. You want to speak on those two advocacies that you've been involved with?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just to say about the minerals and the mineral oil, you don't have much of an option on how you enter. when you have restricted Indian land, the Bureau of Indian Affairs sometimes governs what you're doing. And so, you know, I don't always have a say on whether or not I can lease minerals to this pipeline. So it's always an issue. When you can resist it and you can protect your property, that is something that I try to do, but that's not always the case. So I'm always interested in this issue. And when Dakota Access Pipeline was beginning to come, and this little Standing Rock Sioux reservation, where I don't know what their poverty ranking is among the reservations in North and South Dakota, but it's probably pretty bad. Dorothy Lester might be able to speak to that, but it's a pretty poor reservation. And for them to say, okay, we're going to stand up and be counted on this issue. We are not letting them contaminate our groundwater, and we're not going to let them ruin the waterways that are coming through here, because we need these for resources. So they had started the demonstrations probably 3 years ago, early in the summer. And they made an encampment, just like Mauna Kea had the little encampment around it, and people could go in and stay or spend the night. They got people to advocate with them to go and demonstrate. So my friend and I said we wanted to go up and see, because we can do advocacy here in Oklahoma and do fundraising for them if we needed to. So she and I went up to be with them, and not knowing really what to expect. But the helicopters were overhead when we got there about 4:30 in the morning for their sunrise service. They told us that there would be a spiritual people there to lead us through the morning prayers, take us to the hillside where we would demonstrate, and then come back and have lunch and some lessons on how to be a good advocate. And in there, they had started a school for the kids of the protesters. They had a little clinic. Then they had a store for clothing and food and several other things that you would need in a village. And it was being well stocked by people from the outside, helping them do this. And people from around the world were coming, and you were encouraged to bring a flag from your nation and put that flag along the pathway into the encampment. And so ours was already there from previous visitors, and there was a Hawaiian flag, and I recognized it. And then there was a flag from the Philippines, from Indonesia, Canada, you know. So then you begin to look around and see people from around the world, essentially, at this little encampment. And it struggled mightily because there were people trying to shut it down, the government and so forth. And then so they would be moved from one spot to another. But the Hawaiian persons had taken an afternoon to do a ceremony, and you would recognize the calls to come forward and let's do this. And then some of the other songs that you sing, the names I can't remember right offhand, but they did those protocols. And then other cultures did their protocols. And it was just a wonderful afternoon of that kind of global sharing. And so I'm watching on Facebook some of the Hawaiian people who were at Mauna Kea who filmed and sent the video of the Lakota who had come out to Mauna Kea, and they were dancing and also reciprocating with them, the standing with them here, but also standing with them there, and talked about that. And it was really a very moving kind of thing when you think about it. And,
wow. Well, we got two last questions for you. The first one is from Kahu. Jimmy Arona, and he serves out at Kalanapueo and Kalani'Kahuaho in Maui. But he's asking, is the Bible in the Muscogee language? Is that what you call it?
Yes.
So the Bible was translated for
It's the New Testament. It's the New Testament. They translated Genesis and quit, and then they did the Psalms. But so we have Genesis and Psalms, and then this is the New Testament.
Oh goodness! So there needs to be a little bit more translating for the Old Testament pieces, or does that suffice for your?
I think it suffices because we don't think of it as our history. A lot of people talk about, like the book of Exodus is an inspiration for people who are in diaspora. Right. See, we're still in our homeland. We're still in our country. And it's hard to talk about it in the same meaningful way. And then the people who triumph, David carrying in the Ark of the Covenant and those kinds of things and declaring this home when they're doing it over indigenous peoples that they buried underneath them. Those kinds of things just don't work in our thinking, I think. And it's hard to translate that way. So that's that.
So last question from Jocelyn Costa, again from Maui.
Those Maui people, they're brave questions.
So she's asking, what type of support did you get from your conference and the national church as a people to intersect with faith? So did you stand as a representative of the church in protest for faith and truth?
Yeah, we did a lot of those, particularly Native American issues, the sports and media, mascots in sports and media, I think was one of the biggies. But standing with other people, we were always there, like this quorum group, the Council for Racial and Ethnic Ministry. We didn't do anything without each other. And so we stood firm on some of those social justice issues. When we lived in proximity to Washington, D.C., I went down to be with the UCC as they protested. And then the School of the Americas in, is it Augustus, Georgia? Down there to represent it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, okay, I got to put one more in because this is my delegate from my church. So this is Kailani Hess's question because her husband is actually a Muskogee. Oh, he's a
all right.
Yeah, so she's asking, do you have a Muskogee name? Because here in Hawaii, we have both English as well as our Hawaiian names.
Yeah. No, I do not have a formally given name. The people who attend the ceremonial grounds get those names in their participation. I go to the ceremonial grounds, but I don't participate as such for no good reason. I'm very supportive of what they do, but I am not in the ring where names are distributed. Yeah, I don't have a name.
Well,
but I did give my grandson a name, and then we're going to give the baby a name in a couple of weeks that we did. And so my grandson's name is Howithinga Ibo Bagas. Wisdom will reside with us. And then the little one we're working with, Avatski Simolagas, and that's happiness has come to us because he was born the day that the COVID shutdown happened. He was in the hospital being born when they said, okay, no visitors, no family coming in or any of that kind of thing. But in the midst of this horrible situation, happiness came. So that's his name.
Well, this is Reverend Rosemary McCombs Maxey. Thank you. And it's so nice to see you again after all of these years. And
yeah, it's good to see you too, Ken. I remember our time together.
Yeah, and so on behalf of the Hawaii Conference and all of our associations and our member churches, mahalo, mahalo, mahalo for being an advocate, not just for your people, but for ours back here in Hawaii. And we don't have any more questions for you, but again, thank you for sharing your time. I know you're what, 5 hours ahead of us?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But
Yeah, my son is fixing dinner, so it's
okay,
okay.
good. Well, thank you, folks.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry I didn't see everybody's name up here to see if I recognized other people. So besides Ron, I hope there's some other family there that I know.
You're over here too, and you know others. But thank you so much, you folks, for being with us today. And stay tuned for 5 p.m. tonight. We'll be back on with another workshop. So thank you. God bless all of you. Peace be with you. Thank you.
All right, peace be with you. Mahalo and mado.
Oh, we hope.